Yes, I'm happy.
Good evening. Thanks for coming out. I'm not sure if you can hear me through this or not. Does it sound like it? All right, I'm going to retire. It's my pleasure to introduce a very exciting speaker. We're very excited to have him here today. He's traveled a long distance away, almost 8 blocks. It's great to be here today. My name is David Maraca. I'm the Director of Archaeology at Ferry Farm. As you probably know, I recognize a lot of faces here. We've been doing some things lately and changing our landscape a little bit. And so tonight, this is the first of 3 lectures on Ferry Farm, and this one is going to deal with construction. Laura Galke, who's next? Is it Laura? Or me?
Yes, Laura's next.
Laura's next. Here we go. And she's going to talk about archaeology and Mary Washington. Is that right?
Yes.
Thank you. Oh, good. And then Megan is going to follow up the following Tuesday and talk about her research into refurnishing the Washington House. For the people that have been here for a long time, I'm going to go over material that you already know. If I get something wrong, you can just say so, and we'll have a conversation about it, or I'll just accept your word for it. I've been around for 17 years, and so I can take it back to a certain place, but I can't take it all. I wasn't here at the beginning, and so and I know some of you were at the beginning of the Ferry Farm project. And so the first thing I'll tell you is I don't have a pointer with me, so I'm just going to point, and which means I'm going to turn my back to you, so if you can't hear me, just say, "Hey, dummy, you're not facing the audience." That's Ferry Farm over there, across from Fredericksburg. It has been, people have wanted it to be a historic site since the 1920s, and different groups have worked on it through history, each with a dream, amazingly, that dream has actually been very similar as time has gone on, and so in the 1990s, the farmer that owned Ferry Farm was not interested in making it into a historic site, but he knew that the county was, and so he went to the county and said, "Let's make a deal. I will give you the archaeological site, the Washington Boyhood Home Archaeological Site, in exchange for if you upzone the rest of my property." And so that happened and set off a chain of events that is still rippling through the pond. And so Walmart bought that property, and the communities, upon hearing that news, began to organize, and a little snowball became a big snowball, and eventually a national effort to find a different outcome for this property. And so this is a Richmond paper showing a large gathering of people who are clearly listening to someone on a bullhorn. So it's a very grassroots activity, and it just kept growing and growing, and then so halfway through the process, the Kenmore Foundation began to get involved, first quietly and then sort of slowly more and more, and eventually made an offer to Walmart saying that if we will pay you what you paid for it if you will sell it to us. And that's the deal The Walmart moved about 1 mile down the road. It's a super center. It has all the things it was associated with, and the community is very engaged with it. And they're donors to us. And so we buried the hatchet, and so we're very, that was bad, wasn't it? Okay, I won't do that again. And so the problem was, well, as people were trying to figure out how to save this thing, they said we can't just say we're going to save it. We need to make a plan. And so, and you can see that there's two things I point out about this document. One is it's the San Francisco Examiner, yes. And so this is a national story. And then number two, the plan that they came up with was to put the Washington landscape back on the landscape at Ferry Farm. And so that was how that group sold the notion of saving this, and so that became our goal as well as their goal, and so I was hired as part of that effort to find the Washington House and put it back on the landscape. And for me, I'll be honest with you, I only focused on the first part of this problem, and that was, so we put together a team and we went to look for it, and after a while we actually had some success in finding it. And so this is the vision that the people that saved the property, this is how we interpreted their vision. And so there's the archaeology site located right next to the surveyor shed. That's the river down in front of it, the floodplain. And we started in 2001, and in 2008 we announced that we had recovered the archaeological remains of the Washington House. And it's difficult to sort of piece them together because after the Civil War, there was no resources in Stafford County, or very few resources. And so the stones that made up this foundation became a resource, and the owners of the farm began recycling that stone and taking off. And so by the time archaeologists arrived, there actually wasn't very much of the foundation left, but there was enough to sort of figure out how it worked. The good news is it had three major sealed contexts, sealed pits in the ground, and you can see them. Here I am pointing in the dark square, and then the big rectangle, and then you can see this guy down here. That's another root cellar, and then you can see just sort of scattered along. Every time you see a stone, that's a part of the foundation. So there was enough to sort of figure it out. The good news is these sealed pits contain thousands and thousands of artifacts that were either related to the building or related to the Washingtons. And so this is the centerpiece, archaeological centerpiece, which is that cellar in the center. That's a quiet sandstone, mortared together. You can see the blocks are cut. You can see the tool marks on the blocks. Very nicely done, very nicely finished. It was a room that was used as part of display, and they did a great job. Whoever the builders of this did a great job at sort of making it look very finished. Here's when that room is as excavated as it was going to get. We took 3/4 of the fill out, and thousands of artifacts that belonged to the Washington or the building sort of came out of this fill. We left 1/4 in place, and that is still in place, and that's been has a box around it and will be part of the house for as long as until someone comes up with a research design to go and sample some of that. The idea is to preserve that dirt for forever, and then if archaeology changes or new techniques are developed that are minimally invasive, then we'll come in and try and do some of that. There's a root cellar that's right in front of a chimney base that has thousands of Washington artifacts in it, all from the Washington period. That was a great, I'm really happy that feature's turned up. And then from the cellar again, this is a sample of some of the building materials that came out of the house. That's a quiet sandstone for the most part. Lots of plaster, a little bit of brick that's all burned up, some oyster shells, and then this guy, which is a hearthstone. And so we were happy to see him. And so that told us a lot about how the building sort of worked. And so once the excavation was complete, it's sort of the project changed, and we asked Mark Winger of Mesick Cohen Wilson Baker and John Mesick. So John Mesick is the architect, and Mark is the architectural historian, to come and look at our evidence that we collected, both documentary evidence, the physical layout, and the archaeological record, and just figure out what our house looked like. And so I just wanted to, that was one of Mark's project that he and I worked on together in the 90s, and that's the coffee house in Colonial Williamsburg. He figured all that stuff out. So he's probably the best building interpreter in Virginia about Virginia buildings. And and he's got this weird thing about chairs, which I don't really understand. Which I think is a hobby. So this is what he came up with. That's the front, which is the riverside. And so those are just elevations. And then we asked them to come up with the building plans for the building, and he did that as well. He and John Mesick did that as well. So with all our document in hand, there was also a process where we went through permitting. So we had the federal, the state, and the local governments comment on our plans and help us design our plans, and that took a little while. And then last summer we had a groundbreaking out at Ferry Farm. If you went, you'll remember there's two memorable things that happened there. Once it snowed or sleeted on a day when it was physically impossible to sleet. It was like, what day was that on? Do you remember? Zach?
April 28th.
April 28th. That's really late for sleep. That's a night election. And then Doris Kearns Goodwin spoke about sort of the importance of this kind of site. And that was a great day for us. And we were very excited and sort of got the project rolling. So one of the things we knew that we needed was somebody that had been there before, that had taken a house from archaeological sort of evidence or historical evidence and architectural historical evidence, and brought it to life. And we picked this guy, John Jeans. That's his last project. That's Montpelier. He took it from the pink building, the pink version of that, to that building. And so we were really excited to get him. And so now we had essentially 3 Rolodexes of people that we could call to come help build us. But the question in our minds was, are they going to want to work on something that's modern? These are guys and women that make their living working on 18th and even 17th century buildings, and would they be willing to come and work on a modern building? And we didn't know the answer to that, and we were certainly hopeful they would, because our designs were 18th century, and a lot of tricks are sort of incorporated, that things that only people that work on 18th century buildings would know how to do. And so for us, it was critical that we got these people to sort of sign on, but we had no idea if they would or not. And so the other problem we had was that we originally conceptualized the project as building off the archaeology site, because it's hard to build on, have a construction site on an archaeology site without damaging it. And so that was our mindset when we entered into the project, but the more that we thought about that, the less we liked that option. So originally we thought, well, let's just move the building 100 yards downriver. So what does that do? Well, that gets it off the archaeology site and protects the archaeology site. But then the problems are that it doesn't have the same contextual relationship with the landscape around it. The house is in a different place, so from where the house is now, you can see the ferry, you can see the town, you can see the roads. If you move it 100 yards down the road, you sort of lose those. There are a number of outbuildings associated with this. Are we going to move them all in equal distance? And so, so that becomes a problem. And then lastly, once you bury the archaeology, no one will ever see it again. And so we started to wonder, well, what if? Maybe we can have our cake and eat it too. So, any engineers in the room? Okay, I'm sorry. I'm just going to apologize right now. So, my dad is an engineer, so I know this to be all true of all engineers. So, when you ask an engineer a question, the answer is always yes. What they don't tell you is how much it costs and how long it'll take. And so we asked the engineers, is there a way to build this thing on top of the archaeological site without damaging it? And so the engineers heard the problem, they went away, and they came back with this solution. So that's a helical pile. That's a big screw that goes into the ground. It only disturbs the ground the width of the screw. And so it goes in the ground between 27 and 50 feet. It has 43 cousins that form the outline of the foundation. And they only go in places where there's no foundation currently existing. And so this is what it starts to look like. And you can see we're protecting archaeological remains, like right there. They've got the tarp on, and archaeologists are sweating bullets as the thing is going to, anytime it comes close to them. And so eventually they start to put these things in, and then they have heads on top of them. And on top of those heads, we attach a concrete foundation. We form a concrete foundation that's approximately 1 inch above the archaeological remains. So the building is now floating on the heads of those helical piles this far above the archaeology. And so here's the weird thing. We could actually go and have an excavation in some of these areas if we wanted to go back. We left all the foundations in place, but if we wanted to go back and look at them for some reason, we could actually do that for a lot of them. And so there's our base now. And because engineers were nervous, they made it so that you could build a skyscraper on top of it. It will support a skyscraper. It is very substantial. And I'll stop doing that. So then we go back to the problem, well, will they come and work on it? And so this is Ray Canetti. This is the first person that we asked to do this. And he is the premier stone and brick mason in Virginia. I could start listing off his projects, and I'll list off a couple of them, but I'll never get to all of them. We'll just start with the White House. Well, that's a pretty good one. The Jamestown Church, tons of things in Colonial Williamsburg. The That's right, that's the Jameson Church there. Well, he did not Poplar Forest, but Montpelier. He worked on that. And so he said, hey, we have a great project for you. We have 135 tons of boulder. And we'd like you to break them up and make them into small blocks by hand. And he said, no. So he said he was busy and that it was too big of a project and couldn't fit us in. And so I was friends with his wife. And so I called her. I said, can you ask him if he'd reconsider? And so it turns out there was a new hole in his schedule, and he fit it in. And so here's what we asked him to do. Take that boulder and ones like it and reduce it to this size by hand. And so we had collected this material in an odd way. Kenmore needed a new step or two when it was doing its restoration, and we had looked around for apply, which you cannot find because they quit mining it in the 19th century. And so we knew that the Park Service had some because they do, when they need to work on their Aquia buildings in DC, it's the White House and the Capitol are partially made in Aquia. They have a supply, and so we called them up and said, hey, how about you giving us some of that? And they said, no way, you should go away. Don't even think about it. They said, we need all we have. So we went to the Freelance Star and we put a story in the paper saying we were looking for some. And this guy calls us up and he says, I'm putting a new interchange in Stafford on I-95 and I'm going to go through a vein of that. How much do you want? And we said, how much you got? We'll take it all. And so we ended up with this huge pile of boulders. And so they spent, I want to say 6 months doing that, and then they had to go away for a while, and then they came back and did another 3 months of doing that, so 9 months. And so if any of you are thinking of asking Mr. Canetti to do this, I can tell you already, his answer is no. He's not interested in ever doing this again. But he did a great job, and then, and so this was the result of his work. And I don't have anything for scale on the size of those blocks. You'll just have to take my word for it that they're not very big. We asked him to make a lot of those, and he did a great job. So we were feeling pretty good at this point. We'd gotten the guy we had wanted to come and do this, and he was breaking these rocks and making them look great. And we said, you know, it would be good. It would be good if we made mortar like they made it in the 18th century. And so the colonists, they didn't really have limestone in this region. So what they would do was they would take oyster shell and they would put about 6 cords of wood underneath it, and then they would set that wood on fire, and it would burn for a day, and at the end you have lime. Oops. And so, so this is us burning our oyster rick, as it's called. This is before inferno, and then afterwards, and then like 24 hours you have lime, which you store in barrels, and that creates that material. That creates this material. And so that looks like different mortar than any mortar you'll see around, and it's different from any modern mortar because it's an 18th century mortar. So that was great. And so then we said, well, the next one is the timber rights. I have to talk somebody into coming. And so we ended up with Blue Ridge timber rights, and that's an example of what they're used to do. And this was a little different for them. In this case, they were used to working with these materials, but they'd never made an 18th century building before. And so once again, we said we'd like you to do as much as you can with this by hand. And so sure enough, they tried, and eventually the frame went up, executed in a mixture of oak and pine. And so the great thing about this is the pine will dry quickly. The oak, we've been following it, and it will dry in let's see, sometime in 2027 is it supposed to get to its drying thing. So we're very excited about watching our oak dry for the next 10 years and see what that does to our house. But anyway, so that's one of the exciting parts of the next 10 years. So then it was time to put the roof on, and this guy's name is Peter Post. We asked him, and we were really nervous because this was one of those really tricky 18th century roofs. And so you can see up in it's called a cricket. I didn't know any of these words before I started this project. It's where the shingles bend around that corner. And so that's very hard to do. And so he was in between jobs at Bacon's Castle and Mount Vernon, and had an opportunity to come, and so he came and put the roof on for us. And so those are hand-shaped wooden shingles made out of a cypress, and each one of them is sort of nailed on. They're not like the cypress, the shingles that you see now that are real thin, that are going to bend up. These are just going to turn and stay the same, hopefully for the next 50 years. We got carpenters. We got a variety of carpenters. We have a couple of local carpenters, and then Steve Chronister has worked on a number of historic houses, including Monticello and Montpelier, and so they put the clapboard skin on it, and then we said, well, let's continue. So we said, let's not paint it with modern paint. Let's paint it with 18th century paint. And so this is a stain, and we picked the color based on a couple of different things. One is that we recovered this color on a paint on plaster, and so somebody had painted part of the plaster and gotten some paint on it, and there's that color. And then we don't usually take much from Parson Weems, but he has a remembrance of somebody who described it as this color as well. And so it's enough for us to go ahead and go with that. And so the house ended up that color. And that's a stain that's pigmented, and so it won't peel. You just put it on until it penetrates the wood deep enough, and then just keep adding coats until it quits sinking in. So then Panetti and his guys came back and did the stonework, the brickwork for us as well. And so they built the 3 chimneys that are out there. Once again with that special mortar, and so incredibly large, incredibly beautiful chimneys are now on this house. And so we commissioned 2 bits of furniture this year. The one that's painted isn't actually tarred; it gets plastered into the walls, and so it needed to go into the house early before the plaster was done. And so that's Colonial Williamsburg made that for us. And then And then a local furniture maker made the other piece, and that'll be the first freestanding piece to go in the house. Like I said, Megan is going to talk about this process more in 2 weeks. So the next step was to get plasters in, and we wanted the lath in. So the carpenters put the lath in, and ready to have the plaster applied to it. And then the plasters arrived and began sort of applying their plaster to the ceilings and walls of the house. David here is a decorative plaster. He mostly works on decorative plaster, but he's agreed to come and do the flat work for us. And all I can say is, as an Italian, I'm glad I don't have his job. A lot of over his head work. He's very strong in the shoulders and very patient with his materials. And so he's currently applying this material as we speak. And so at the end of the day, this is the front of the house, what it'll look like. It's not quite finished. There's some stairs that need to go on and some shutters, and of course the front door and the hardware. The hardware was made by a guy named Peter Ross, who hammered all the hardware. And so the door locks, the hinges, the shutter dogs, all that stuff are handmade, and so that stuff has to go on yet, and then it will be finished. And so we're very excited. We're very close to the end of this phase of the project. There'll be, that doesn't mean construction will end at Ferry Farm, far from it. We're just beginning this process. At the same time, we decided to put back the landscape around the house, and that includes fencing and paths, and then outbuildings. Documents suggest that there are 10 outbuildings to support this building. We've recovered and excavated 3. And then we've uncovered 2 more that we suspect to go to this period, and then we'll have to look for the next 5. And so that's something that's on the horizon. And then we also are bringing modern amenities to Ferry Farm, and so we're going to have an entranceway, for example, at the Ferry Road light with turn lanes, and so it won't be as exciting to come visit us as it has been. This doesn't affect you, but we're going to abandon our well, and we're going to get water that you can actually drink in the building. And so we're very excited about that. A new maintenance building, new roadways, and then we'll also try and plant. We'll have new plantings, just to make Route 3 a little less influential on our visitors, to try to disguise, so to mask that busy road from around the house. And then, so the purpose of this project is to build a living history museum that's different from other house museums. The fact that we're a rebuilt building allows us to do a lot of things that normally you don't get to do in house museums. And so, for example, we plan on having fires in the fireplace. The windows will be open on days where it's appropriate, and we'll use the breeze to cool the place. We'll have candles. You'll be allowed to sit on the furniture. You'll be able to go through the drawers in some of those cabinets. And so it's a different experience. Megan's in the background. She's all in on this now. We just go around and touch furniture around her. And she's gotten to the point where she doesn't shake anymore when you do it. And so we're very excited. And then the other thing we're doing is we're trying to use archaeology to put the backyard back as accurately as we put the house in. And so, you know, that's a tall order, and I don't think there are a lot of historic sites that can say, you know, this is the best. We think this is the closest we can get to understanding the space around the house. And so we're very excited about that. I'm working on a project now to create artifacts that are safe for the midden, which is the area where trash is thrown away. And so I'm putting animal bone in peroxide, trying to make it sort of kill all the germs off of it. I'm rounding the edges off of ceramics and glass, and the idea is to scatter these materials around the house where trash accumulated in the 18th century. I don't think there's any other house around that has this one. So you'll get to see sort of a more realistic portrayal of what the 18th century looked like. And then when you go inside the house, it should have a different feel to it. It shouldn't be sterile. It should feel like someone lives there, and so and it is lived in. And so the candles and the fire. I don't know that we're having a cat. Alma's allergic, but it's not beyond the possibility. And sort of you get a really different feel for what the Washingtons, how the Washingtons lived. And that's our goal. And we're hoping that you will be excited by this and embrace this approach. And so it's going to take us a while to get to that. Everything takes, you know, I've learned that construction is slow and that furnishing is slow. But as time goes on, every day that goes by, we get sort of closer and closer to our goal. So, all right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, if you're willing to talk about some of the challenges for things like fire codes or building an old house, it still has to be safe, and any kind of cheat sheet you got that checks it should be combined with
So I'm not sure everybody heard the question. And so the question was, so how do you build an 18th century house and in the modern world with modern requirements, sometimes mandated by at least code. So originally we talked about building a slave quarter first, and this was a long time ago. And so we went to the county and they said, that'll be great, we love it. Now the exit sign needs to be above the door. And we're like, okay, we're in a different world. And so one of the ways that we dealt with that was we were originally zoned for Walmart. And with the help of one of the supervisors, he put in a request to rezone us into a category that Stafford didn't even have, historic district. And so he wrote the code for that zoning to come into existence. The county voted on that, and then we became the first applicant, and we're now the first people in that zoning. And so that lets us not have some of the issues that we ran into originally. But that doesn't mean you get to go all of them. For example, accessibility. We really want to be accessible, and that's not part of the 18th century world. So we're going to make accommodations for that, and we're okay. One of the other problems we ran into was we have a wooden house with a wooden roof, and we're talking about having fires and candles in it. We know what happened in the 18th century to these buildings. They all burn up. And so we thought, well, maybe we want to have a fire suppression system. And we said, okay, let's have a fire suppression system. So then the problem came, well, the fire suppression system requires heat. You can't let that stuff freeze. And so now we have a heating system. And it's like, okay, well, if you're going to have heat, maybe you could have a little air conditioning if it's really horrible. And so we put a little bit of air conditioning in for really terrible days. And so that wasn't really intended. That wasn't where we were going, but it's sort of necessity of sort of modern life. And so we asked the fire marshal, and the fire marshal didn't really care about it. He says, you're not required to have a sprinkler system, but it's, it certainly makes sense for a modern institution to have a system. And so that's the kind of stuff we did. So we tried to make as much of it as we could out of 18th century, using 18th century materials in the 18th century way. But when we had to sort of branch away from that and go and sort of accommodate the modern world, we did that too. And so you won't be able to see any of that. Hopefully it'll all be hidden away, but it'll still be there. And you shouldn't. Hopefully you won't even be able to hear it, but you should feel the air conditioning. And so the heat is incredibly quiet. It's tubes that run through under the wooden floor with water, hot water, and so it just radiates the heat into the floor and heats the house. There is a system to it, but it's not one that you would recognize as part of modern. So the question is, how did we waterproof the roof shingles? So they're not. There's a barrier underneath them that allows water to penetrate, that keeps water from penetrating, but it also disperses it. And so it'll get wet. And so eventually in 5 years, we'll let those that roofing material dry out a little bit, and eventually we will treat them, and that'll add 15 years to its life. So we're doing that stuff, but we're doing it sort of as it makes sense, to extend the length of how long it will survive.
What were the major deciding factors on how the final house looked? Other than, obviously you had the foundation and all that, but were there other houses that had that kind of foundation that would support, how was that figured out?
So it's just like Jurassic Park. So we had the foundation, and then we had the material that we recovered, hundreds of thousands of pieces of the house. And Mark went through and tried to figure out what each piece meant. And so from one piece of plaster, he figured out the orientation of the staircase. He found a piece of plaster that was underneath where the stairs met the second floor and made a turn. And he figured out that that's the orientation, and so that informed that kind of stuff. So, and then there's historical documents, sort of about the house. Our probate inventory lists names the rooms and talks about how they were used, and so that was really helpful. And then, as in Jurassic Park, when they didn't have the dinosaur DNA, they used a frog. Well, our frog is other 18th century houses, and that's where Mark came in. He was very familiar with other 18th century houses, and we mostly aimed at regional houses. And so, but in the house dates to the 1720s, and there aren't a lot of surviving examples. So he went all over Virginia to sort of get the answers to those questions.
Good evening. Is it possible to export your presentation in a digital format?
Zach?
Sure.
Sure. Great. I don't know what that means, though.
I'm not sure I do
Was the house built by the Washingtons, or was it there prior?
So yes and no. So it starts out building by the Struthers family, who lived there before the Washingtons, and they execute essentially an L-shaped house, and then Augustine Washington turns it into a rectangle. And so he's responsible for a little less than half of the house. So both families, we claim both families, by the way. We have the Struthers Society come all the time. And the Struthers and the Washingtons were very close socially and economically, and had a lot of interactions, and most of them friendly, occasionally a lawsuit. And so, so we tell the story of the Struthers as well. And once we have a new visitor center, which will have exhibit space for us, we'll do a much better job of telling the story of the other occupants of the landscape, including unbuilt landscapes. So there's people living on our landscape for about 12,000 years, and we like to tell, all their stories. And we'll use our exhibit space to do that.
Could you give a very short history of the Struthers so we get the context?
Sure. So when the town is being considered or established, William Strother moves here. He's a lawyer, and he thinks because the town will have a court system that he'll have something to do, but he also wants a plantation. So he locates just outside of town and builds his plantation. He has the misfortune of having 6 daughters and no sons, and so when he, I have that same situation, not 6, but so I speak with some authority on this. So in the 18th century, they could inherit, and so in his will, he told his wife to auction it or sell the house and move, and she followed his instructions. The Struthers are a major player in early establishment of the town, and they're either cooperating with the Washingtons or vying with them for sort of influence, and eventually the Washingtons sort of become one of the dominant families of Fredericksburg, and the Struthers essentially move away to another place.
How large was the plantation?
So this is a little tricky. It changes sizes regularly. And at its largest, it's 600 acres. But then the problem is that acreage doesn't actually touch each other. And we think the Washingtons rented the space in between them. And so it's 600 acres of owned land, but when you start to consider rented land, it's like 1,000 acres or above at some times, at certain times of its life. Chatham, on the other hand, is always lurking in the background. And when things are good, Chatham, starts to swallow its neighbors. And then when things are bad, it spits them out. And so, you seem to see that in the night after the Washingtons are gone. So I assume that's how the Washingtons worked as well, and before Chatham sort of came onto the scene.
When you tour the house, will you be able to see some of the old foundations, all of the architectural?
Yes, so I haven't spent any time talking about that, but yes, there'll be for all our viewers, there's a viewport sort of built into the stairs and the passage, and you can actually just open a door and you can look down and see sort of the stones that the Washingtons experienced, as part of that cellar that I showed you at the beginning, a very substantial cellar. You can see that. And then for behind the scenes tours, you would actually, you then would go into that cellar. We need security. All right. I know where you live. So it'll be open. Well, I'm going to a meeting tomorrow. We're going to talk about that. So I think it was originally scheduled to open early in the fall. So I'm going to do the math. That's pretty soon. We've had a problem with our a little problem come up, and so I'm not sure exactly.
So it's going to be a ribbon cutting there.
I wouldn't be surprised if sometime soon there's a ribbon cutting. So yes, coming up soon. So my colleague says that I should remind you that there's a web page that has tons of videos, and on our web page and on our blog, and that the web page has a button on it that says, what does it say again? Oh, yeah, donate. And so if you wanted to push that button, we would love for that to happen as well. I still have a little bit of time. So.
The house that was there, the last house that was there that I think burned in the 90s or something.
90s, that's correct.
Was that house near the original site, home site?
So it's a little confusing because the farm owner who built that farm said, I built my house on the remains of the Washington house. And he was almost right. I think he built his house on the remains of the standalone kitchen. And so it has a cellar in it made of stone, and he saw that stone cellar and interpreted that as the house. But when we analyzed the material that came out of it, it burned in the 1740s, and we think it's actually a kitchen, filled with kitchen material. And so yes, that farmhouse is very close. It's like 100 feet away from where we have it shown, but it's not as close as it originally thought.
What kind of artifacts?
So the question is, what kind of artifacts do we find? We found thousands and thousands and thousands of domestic artifacts that are associated with the Washingtons. And so architectural material, stuff from their daily foodways, the things that they ate. Laura is signaling me that I should mention big curlers. So we have, Laura, when I get in trouble, you just let me know. We have the largest collection of recovered wig curlers from any non-wig manufacturer site. And what it does is it tells us some of the systems the Washingtons put in place after Augustine Washington died, and Mary chose to be a widow. And so archaeology has spent years sort of trying to identify the systems that how the Washingtons cope with adversity. And so this is one of the ways that we have uncovered that sort of talks about it. And I think the number is 214 wig curlers. But Laura just finished an experiment where she tried to mend them back together, and thinking that if we'd gotten them all, we should, because they only break in two pieces, we should make a lot of mends. And 15 of them mended back to whole, suggesting that we're not even close to finding all of them. And so we're going to need to push our excavation farther to the east to recover more of those things. And so we're very excited about we're trying to pass a manufacturing, a wig manufacturing site. That's our goal.
Tell us about the outbuildings, what purposes?
Sure.
What you found.
Right. So the question is, we'll talk about the outbuildings. The first outbuilding we ran into appears to be a slave quarter from the Washington period. It's located just north of the house, and is sort of classic Virginia slave quarter for that period of material, and it is sort of identical to other slave quarters that have been recovered. Both the physical remains of it and the material that was found in it are sort of match most Virginia slave persons. So we're real excited about that. Then we have the farmer's building that he built his house on, so that's a kitchen. So we're going to put that in our bank. And then we've been working in the work yard behind the house and have found two buildings. One that we've excavated and understand is a little storehouse, one that we have not excavated yet. And then we put the lines from for the fire suppression system way away from the site so it wouldn't hit anything. So it hit a building that looks, it's a perfect 18th century building. It has wig curlers in it just to make things even more interesting. And so it will have to go, so we moved that trench and then we'll have to go and excavate that as well. So we have 5 of those. What we expect to find is dairies, smokehouse, laundry house, barns, a stable. There should be a second kitchen. If the first one burned in 1740, they're going to need another one. So we're going to hope to find that. And then little small farm buildings. They said we expect to find a lot of buildings around Support. Hey, Art.
When you say behind the house, you mean away from the road?
On the land
On the
side.
road side.
On the road side. That's correct. I'm sorry. Yes. So, and then there'll be fences and paths and all sorts of, in the 18th century, you divide your property up into different yards. And so each of those yards should we should uncover those yards and understand how that's all working.
That would be filled with. Are you going to put it in an outhouse?
So, so an outhouse is probably the most disgusting thing you can think of. Except for what they actually did, which is just use chamber pots and what's the little one called?
A Bordaloo.
Portaloos, and so you have your enslaved people empty those, and they don't want to go out if the weather's bad, and so they just toss it out to the backyard into where I was talking about the min yard. And so there's just this little area of horribleness that we're trying to recreate in a sort of sensible, sort of modernly acceptable way. So that's a challenge.
How many people did the farm support, both family members and slaves?
So it changes through time. We have a series of snapshots from different periods, sort of different years. And so I can tell you that the Washington family, sort of 2 adults and I'm going to say 6 kids. And then the number of enslaved people ranges up to 30 at one point. 10 were situated at the house, and another 20 were at a satellite slave quarter. And then indentures. There's no record of indentures, but Augustine does indenture. He does sort of indenture people at his other plantations, and so they could be out there as well. So at its height, there could be 40 people.
Are you interpreting the site to a specific time period, specific date?
Okay, you can get escorted out. And that's our time. So yes and no. So the house looks new. But it's built like it would look between 1740 and 1750. Historically, 1750 is an incredible year for us. And so the furnishings will probably reflect around 1750. And so we are storytellers, as you'll learn in the next 3 weeks. And so our best stories are about 1750. So that's what we're going to shoot for. Now, does that say that something really cool didn't happen in 1777 and we won't talk about it? No, we will talk about it. So So most days it'll be around 1750. They preserve the right to belong.
I guess I understood it was going to be about Washington's Ford, so it is.
No, 1750. He's still considered a boy. You're not allowed to take possession of your land until you're 21. So they have a long childhood in the 18th century for boys. Now, most of their schooling is done, and they just hang around and do bad. But George is actually working. So we're going to tell the stories of him becoming a man, and the things and the influences that Ferry Farm had on him. And we're, like I said, we're willing to wander a little earlier than 1750 to tell those stories, because eventually in 1752 he becomes old enough to. 1753, he's old enough to take possession of his land. So he always allows very much.
You're fading off.
My voice is going. You've exhausted this resource. All right, I'm going to say goodbye and thank you all for coming out.